seeing that at some point home was a flux and everything was fuzzy, did you at any point did you ever hit you that look, I'm not home? Like when was the first time it hit you that look, I'm not home?
That feeling never goes away. You know, the saddest moments of my life in the past, probably in all of my adult life, is moments when I think about what I consider home, which is still, back home in
Mm,
Iran. I think about, the reality that I had to leave a lot of things behind
mm,
for good reasons. Like, I have achieved a lot of things in my life since I left. So, it was a compromise worth making. But the reality is that I have made that compromise. Like, I had left things behind. So, in my saddest moments, I do have the strongest connection still with back home, with Iran, thinking about, you know, I wish, that would be the place where I achieve all of the things that I
mm,
am trying to achieve now. Right. So, um, and, it's not a feeling that I have every day or a feeling that, is very overwhelming, but there are moments that it becomes extremely overwhelming, like that feeling that I don't really belong here. Like culturally, I have adopted, I have accepted this as my identity. I have accepted that this is the best compromise, but ultimately it's a compromise, right? But you know, the reality is that I don't really have a home. Like, I'm defining the best I can
mm.
as my home.
Have you ever wondered what it's like to leave behind every single thing you know and start a new life in a foreign country? From my experience, it can be a struggle. On the Newcomers Podcast, I'll be sharing my story as well as the stories of other immigrants. We'll be talking about the joys and struggles of starting afresh. My name is Dozier, and I'm looking forward to being your host.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Newcomers Podcast, where I, Dozier, chat with immigrants like myself about, all the feels about moving to a new country. Today with me, I have Amir. Did I get your name right?
Yes.
Great, great, great. Today we're talking about, he's been here since 2008, so he's like an experienced immigrant, if I can use that term. So how's it been for you? Like that's like you've been here for like that's like 15, 16 years,
15
right?
years, yeah. Well, I mean, minus 2 years that I went to England.
Mm,
So I'm a little more experienced with immigrating too, because I immigrated here first, then I went to England, then I moved back here, and last year also I spent a lot of time traveling,
mm.
different countries and different cities. So I kind of like moving around, if you wish.
I see you're a perpetual newcomer. I see that.
I'm a newcomer back in Toronto
Awesome.
since last year. So
Awesome. I kind of I was going to ask you about your first time, but I think I'll ask you this question, which is something that I'm trying to find an answer to myself. Do you ever think that there's a period where you feel like you've settled in? Do you think that ever happens to you?
uh, that's a very, very deep question, and that needs a lot of deep discussion, because I don't think I ever felt settled in, since I moved to Canada in 2008. I came to Canada as a student, and being a student, that's a temporary visa, like the name comes with it, right?
Mm,
Like, you're temporarily here, you're only allowed to study and not even work and all that, right? So, like, there is always the intention of, oh, maybe I'll stay here and live here afterwards, but that's a temporary status, and I was on that temporary status for 6 years, when I did my PhD. And then towards the end of it, it is very normal for academics to go to a different university, a lot of the time a different country, and do postdocs, which means that again, like that's a temporary job. You do it for a couple of years. Potentially, you move to another postdoc to a different country. So, and that's what I did. Like I went to England, I did a postdoc there. Uh, that was a 2-year position. So by default, again, it was a temporary thing. I knew most probably I'll end up moving again. Like even if, I had any ambition of staying in the university I was working in as a postdoc, it probably would have been like a 5-year thing, like still, again, like a temporary thing. And at that point, I was feeling it. Like I had this idea in my head that, okay, I'm tired of moving around. And that was part of the reason that I left academia, because, I wanted to choose where I wanted to live. But, due to a range of personal reasons, I wanted to go to the States, and professional reasons, like for work as well. I wanted to go to the States. But then I got hit by Trump era. And then by COVID. So, that sort of transition from England to the States is still ongoing for me. So I know, this ended up being, a longer answer that probably you're hoping for, but yeah, that does not exist for me. Like I'm always in this state of flux. And as I said, even last year, I was like, I'm tired of being, stuck in Toronto. So I'm just gonna. I spent almost 8 or 9 months of the year traveling.
Mm.
Like even when I was back in Toronto, I was going to different neighborhoods every month, right? So yeah, that as long as as far as my personal experience goes, that has not yet happened for me.
And just kind of digging deeper into that feeling now. So when you go back home, like where you're originally from, does it feel like home for you, or you still kind of feel like you're in between? You're partly Canadian or partly English, and you're partly from your home country. Like, do you ever feel like because sometimes it feels like as an immigrant, you're stuck somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it's a mid Atlantic feeling, if you wish. Um, so I mean, the crazy thing about where I'm from is that I'm from Iran, and the country has been in a bit of a chaos, over the past, well, probably 40 years. But, especially since I left, situation is, increasingly complicated. And, believe it or not, I have not been back since I left in 2008. Like I usually see my parents when they visit me, or if they're visiting one of my siblings, and I, travel to the country where my siblings are. So I never really went back home, um, and I even have, at this point, after all of these years, I even have, which is very related to what we were discussing. Like I have trouble even defining what I consider home. One of the reasons that I didn't love living in England, although there was a lot of soccer every day, and I was really enjoying playing the game and being in the right time zone for all of the soccer games. And I love the accent. I didn't love living there because to me it felt like a weird culture that was half traditional, half modern. And of course, I was living in a smaller town. I'm sure London would have been a different experience. Um, but definitely, that was one of the very first times that I felt culturally completely out of place. Toronto is probably the place that I feel most at home, probably because I lived here the longest, but also I have a very strong network of people that I know and I consider friends, people that I can call, in the middle of the night if something bad happens, right? So, yeah, the concept of home becomes very, very fuzzy, as you say, and becomes very difficult to define and rely on. And the interesting thing is that that's only one of the concepts that becomes fuzzy. And there are a lot of things that you take for granted, but moving around makes a lot of things that you take for granted very, very fuzzy, because you see people have different definitions and they're completely fine living with those definitions.
Do you want to explore a couple of those things that get fuzzy? I'd like to talk about them with you.
Okay.
Yeah, so could you share a
What
couple
are
of them?
examples?
Yeah.
So a lot of cultural things, right? Like, I come from, like, I was raised Muslim,
Mm,
right? I was religious, when I was a kid, because, that was like, I grew up in a small town, back in Iran, and, traditional beliefs and how you carried out your life
mm,
was the only thing that was presented to me. My father is a highly educated person, and he was the only counter narrative that I had. But everything else about the society was like, this is how you behave and this is how you behave, right? And when I went to my undergrad to a different city, when I went to my grad school in a different city, like every time I did a move like that, I left a part of what I considered myself behind. And because, when I went to this slightly bigger city, I saw, oh, people are not doing A, B, and C, and they're fine, they're happy, they're healthy, they're prosperous. Then I went to, the capital of Iran, to Tehran, and I saw that, oh my God, like they're completely, doing these three other things completely differently, and they're fine and prosperous and happy. Then I came to Toronto, that just like that shedding kept happening, that I kept dropping everything about all of the traditional things that I believed in, and I realized that I was fine without them. And that continued to the point where, you know if that shedding continues happening, at some point you're going to hit a very strong identity crisis, right? Like you're
mm,
going to hit, you're going to get to a point, especially if you're raised in a religious society where
mm.
your identity is very, very tightly entangled with
Your
tradition
religion. Mm,
and religious beliefs. And all of a sudden, as I was going through these evolutions, there was these points that I got really interested in, what atheists thought, what people from different religions thought about how this universe works. um, and that really brings you to this point of almost nihilism, to this point that you're like, wait a minute, does anything matter, right? And then all of a sudden, at least for me, the way things happened was that then I passed even that and got to a point that I realized, and I really like Noah Hariri, because he really articulates this well in *Sapiens* and and a lot of other his work, that you get to this point of, okay, nothing really matters, and then you get to this point beyond that, that is like, wait a minute, other people's define how I should behave. Now I can define how I should behave for myself,
mm,
right? And this process of immigrating, moving around a lot, and interacting with a lot of people, especially living in Toronto, where I can interact with people from all sorts of cultures in one place,
mm.
really, really accelerated, this process of getting me to this point where I'm like, wait a minute, I can define my own happiness. I can define my own life purpose. And that's liberating and powerful. And that's probably part of the reason that I ended up becoming an entrepreneur.
I love the story because it's so true. Like it's like immigration means that, the way you put it about shedding a part of yourself every single time you move to a new place, and then having to battle with that internal crisis of, am I actually doing the right thing? Like, is this who I am? Or who am I really? Like, what am I? Like, what am I? Am I what do I exist to be if every single time I move to a new culture or a new society, I have to adopt? What people don't talk about adopting is that adopting also means it's not just changing, it means dropping stuff. And some of those things you need to drop are literally like part of the pillars that define how you see the world and how you view the world. And
That's right.
it's a very scary journey, to be honest. I mean, I like how you put it, and you put it so beautifully. But it's a really scary journey to go on. Like, you're like, okay, you know, and now I'm gonna just kind of. Sorry, I'm staying on this for a long time, but
It's okay.
now seeing that at some point home was a flux and everything was fuzzy. Did you at any point did it ever hit you that look, I'm not home? Like when was the first time it hit you that look, I'm not home? You know?
Yeah. um, you're getting to the vulnerable parts. That feeling never goes away. The saddest moments of my life in the past, probably in all of my adult life, is moments when I think about what I consider home, which is still, back home in
Mm,
Iran. I think about, the reality that I had to leave a lot of things behind
mm,
for good reasons. Like, I have achieved a lot of things in my life since I left. So, it was a compromise worth making. But the reality is that I have made that compromise. Like, I had left things behind. So, I do have the strongest, in my saddest moments, I do have the strongest connection still with back home, with Iran, thinking about, you know, I wish, that would be the place where I achieve all of the things that I
mm,
am trying to achieve now. Right. So, um, and, it's not a feeling that I have every day or a feeling that, is very overwhelming, but there are moments that it becomes extremely overwhelming, like that feeling that I don't really belong here. Like culturally, I have adopted, I have accepted this as my identity. I have accepted that this is the best compromise. But ultimately, it's a compromise, right?
yeah.
Ultimately, it is the fact that I'm defining this as, my new identity, my new home, the place it's a base that I keep going back to. But you know, the reality is that I don't really have a home. Like, I'm defining the best I can
Mm,
as my home. A lot of people might have different experiences. Like, a lot of people might have immigrated and ended up settling down. Like, they did the school, then they got married, and, they have kids and house and blah, blah, blah. So, the definition of home is probably a little easier for them. But for me, who is largely unattached to a lot of, relationships that, pin you down in one place, like, buying a house is an activity that, pins you down to a
mm,
place. And probably it becomes easier mentally and emotionally to say, okay, this is my
yeah.
home now. But I've never done that, and it's never been attractive to me. But there are so many moments, when you're sad and vulnerable, that you're like, maybe I should have that. Right.
Yeah.
But I never choose to do it. So, or
Yeah.
haven't so far, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I think it's a continuous journey. I remember talking to a friend of mine who we were at a party and he's been in the States since you moved before him. I think you moved in 2008. I think he moved like 2012 or 2013. And he hasn't gone home since then.
Yeah.
Well, both from Nigeria too. And I asked him, like, are you settled? And he's like, no. He's like, I'm not settled. And I don't know if I'm ever going to settle. I'm always going to feel like I'm always just here and there.
Yeah.
I'm married now. I have two kids. I own a house. He actually even owns a house.
Yeah.
But he's like, I still feel like I'm not here. Like I don't, I'm just coasting,
Yeah.
I'm like, sometimes surfing a wave. And I kind of know that any moment from now, I'm going to fall off the wave into the water. But
Yeah.
somehow I still keep my balance and keep going and still waiting for that fall, but
Right.
I don't fall. And just that treading that fine line between will I fall or will I not fall? Like I can just imagine what it does to someone's mental health and just the
Yeah.
fact that you have to continuously keep hyping yourself or keep trying to say to yourself, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this, you've got this covered. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, I mean, what was your biggest, let's go back to Like the first time you moved to Toronto for school, like what was your biggest cultural shock? Like when you moved,
Like literally everything.
yeah.
Again, like I was coming from a relatively traditional and conservative society. So, although at the point when I moved here, I already had questioned, a lot of the traditional, beliefs that I had and probably had moved past them. That a state of being alone in a new country where the majority of the cultural landmarks are very unfamiliar with how you were raised
Mm,
is a huge problem. Like, I definitely have, I didn't know what mental health was, in the first year that I was here. But, I definitely had a lot of mental health problems, like, moments that, that sad moment in shower that you're like, what the fuck did I do with my life? Right.
mm,
Like that definitely happened in that first year. But I always try to remind myself that you did this for a reason. There's this prize that you're after. There's this compromise that you made. Um, but everything, like from how people dressed to how people ate to how people socialized to how people, and obviously in the first year, my language skills were,
mm,
15 years worse than now, right? Like it's not great now, but it was 15 years worse. So like even being able to integrate into the society was very difficult. Like with our research team, we would go to like a pub to drink and talk after work, and my colleagues start, and inside the work environment, I'm very familiar with the vocabulary because that's what I do every day. But then all of a sudden that shift happens where people start talking about life, so the vocabulary is different, and all of a sudden I'm like, I can't follow what is happening, right? And that's very difficult. Like all the way to very specific mistakes that you make, like either you say something wrong or you understand what they said wrong and you answer incorrectly. And there's that embarrassment of, oh my god, I said this thing, and they're probably laughing at me in their head, right? uh, and it wasn't until I saw white European people making the same mistake to realize that, oh, okay, people who are not English speakers don't have to be English speakers.
yeah.
There were a lot of relearning my confidence, I think, that had to happen in that first year and probably the years after as well. But the first year was tough. The first year was a lot of moments where you know I didn't know if I fit here, but I'm glad that I toughed through it.
I mean, like, I'm really happy to hear you say that because also for me, sometimes, I mean, like, I'm here 3 years, almost 3 years now, and yeah, there's this struggle where you're not sure if you really fit in because, like you said, we totally underestimate how culture is broken into linguistic,
Yep.
visual, behavioral, and each of these three pillars morphs and changes depending on the context.
Yeah.
So if you went out with a bar to your friends, the linguistic culture is extremely different from the
That's
work
right.
one. The work one is the easiest one for immigrants to catch up on because one, we either know the lingua franca of the
Yeah.
job itself, and so because of all the things that happen at work, we can get in there and be normal. But once
Yeah.
you step out of that into the casual environment, then okay, we are like, okay, what
Yeah.
did they mean here? How do you say stuff like this? And you just keep second guessing yourself for a very long time,
Yeah.
and like because I second guess myself a lot sometimes, and I'm like, okay, should I say this? Is this how they would say it? So sometimes I just keep quiet. I just like, yeah, I mean, just keep quiet
Yeah.
and just listen, But I guess it's part of the story.
Yeah, I mean, it never really goes away, right? Like that the fact that you make language mistakes is always going to be there. The fact that you're not going to get a lot of the pop culture references is always going to be there. Like, unless you proactively try to fix those. But what will happen is that there's a transition moment that you realize it doesn't matter. Nobody cares. Like those who are impatient and probably racist about the fact that you have an accent and the fact that you don't know things, you don't want them in your life anyway.
Yeah.
And those who are patient with you, those who, carefully listen to what you're saying, even though you have an accent, or those who, autocorrect all of the language mistakes you're making, those are the people that you want to surround yourself with anyway, right?
Yeah.
And ultimately you'll find your people that way. Like they're not even necessarily people who talk speak your language, your mother language, but they might be from different cultures. That's why they understand it. Or they might be native English speakers and they're just okay with the fact that this is you and they accept you as you are.
Mm. Just kind of staying on this point about acceptance and friends and all that. So when I was interviewing, she talked about something which let me not say my thoughts on that. So you talk about it, you give me your answer. She said sometimes as an immigrant, you get the sense that people that get you the most are fellow immigrants.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts on that?
People who get you the most are people who have similar stories to you. Immigration is part of your story, but it's not all of your story.
Yeah.
I agree, with that sentiment that you end up in communities that are mostly immigrants a lot of the time. But the bigger picture is really the fact that you share a story. You have something to talk to them about, right? Like you don't have to prove yourself to them. Like they already have accepted you the way you are with your imperfections because they understand that they're imperfect themselves, right? And they know how to deal with that emotional, up and down of being imperfect. I was telling somebody a few days ago was that, we can fight about things and then be okay about it, right? Like the fact that you have a common understanding of these are the emotions that are involved in our interaction and this is how we deal with it, is really the part that makes the relationship work or not. Either it is a work relationship, personal relationship, intimate relationship, or anything like that. And of course, statistically speaking, us as immigrants end up having the most common stories and experiences with other immigrants. So it's not a necessarily absolute relationship, as I gave a counterexample. And I think really it just really goes back to that mindfulness, to that ability to take a step back and understand, okay, out of this interaction, this is how I felt and this is why I felt this way. And when you see things that way and you stop taking things personally, thinking that something that was said was a personal attack on you or something that was done in a different way than what you expected, was not anything personal. That's just the cultural reference of that person. Starts to understand that there are new references, there are new common ways of interacting with people, and that's ultimately what forms your tightest and closest friendships.
This has been good, to be honest. This has been really, really good. Last question I have for you is, what's the one thing you would have done differently when you look back at the past 15 years of your journey?
I have a bit of a problem with that question because generally speaking, I have done things the way I did because that was the information that was available to me at the time that I did it. And I made the decisions, hopefully the best decisions among, the decisions that were available to me, the options that were available to me. So generally speaking, I think, I have a bit of a philosophical problem with that question because it implies that I could have done things differently. And I think if I go back, I would tell my 20 something year old self who just had come to Canada
Mm,
to just accept that fact much, much, much earlier. Like, just be
mm,
comfortable with who you are, be comfortable with defining who you want to be, and just understand that other people are imperfect too.
mm,
And the way you combine your imperfections to have, beautiful moments, to help each other out, to build new things together, is the thing that ultimately makes a difference.
mm.
Nothing else really matters. Like, all of these things that we take for granted and feel embarrassed about, ultimately they don't matter. Like, it is all the relationships you create that are valuable and can contribute to who you will become.
Thank you so much, Amir. Like, this has been beautiful too.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. Like, I feel like we had the best. Like, this is one of the best conversations I've had on this pod so far. Because we
I'm glad
really
to.
talk about the hard things, the things that some people don't like to talk about, like those hard things. Thank you, and
Of
thank you
course.
for coming on the Newcomers podcast.